Welcome to Reader's Advisory Military Fiction. Tonight we have one of our staff experts from the Laurel Branch Library. His name is Jimmy Klaus. His favorite genre in the entire world is military fiction. My name is Karen Loma. I am also a librarian over at the Laurel Branch, and we're looking forward to showing you everything you could ever want to know about military fiction tonight. So Jimmy, let's start with what is military fiction? Just what is the genre? What makes it so special?
Well, military fiction is just what the name implies. It's fiction that is written either by the military, about the military, or some form of the military. And normally it's a recollection of what went on by the members of the armed services, either the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, sometimes with your civilian intelligence agencies like the CIA, the DIA, and those groups. It's a very fast-paced, thrilling fiction. And some of the major authors, Tom Clancy from Maryland, right here, Harry Patterson, Dale Brown, Webb Griffin. They're all fast, good authors that have written a whole lot of books for this growing genre. I've been reading military fiction for years, and it seems to get better and better every year.
So what makes it so exciting and thrilling? Why isn't it called a thriller instead of military fiction?
Because it's about the military. There is a sense of truth that it actually could have happened. And you say, how could this gentleman know how to write this without delving into the files of the military? And how could the authors, he or she, recollect all these things unless they were there? It's like it's a story being told of time period.
So it sounds like military fiction. What makes it so unique is that you feel as though you're set in that time place as a person in the military who is encountering those missions or activities. That's what makes it so unique.
Or like you could be in some of the missions, you could be in the cockpit of that plane as it's going over to bomb some target of somebody that is up against the United States or whoever you are working with. Or you could be a CIA agent trying to get kids out of East Germany right after World War II.
Sounds like it's a little bit escapist too, except, in a different time era.
Yes.
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple of your favorite authors. What is your favorite book in the genre?
My favorite book in the genre is Tom Clancy's Hunt for Red October.
And what makes it your favorite?
It's just that Clancy wrote it like you could actually be in that Soviet submarine, or you could be a little bird sitting on Jack Ryan's shoulder when he went out to that submarine. You know what's going on. I mean, Tom Clancy is an author that he can get rather long-winded at times, but he tells you details to bring the characters and the surroundings to life. Like he tells you that you're in a 100-meter long submarine, that it's the biggest sub the Soviets have ever built, and that the captain is defecting to the United States with this sub, and you think that you are a little birdie sitting up in the corner of that sub watching all this going on.
So you're like an over observer watching everything, like point of view is just like, I'm in there with it. I'm not the actor doing it, but I'm right there in the seat with them.
Yeah, like you're sitting on Captain Ramios's shoulder when he's in his command chair giving commands to outwit other Soviet submarines. You're like right there, you're like almost getting inside of Captain Ramios's head. What are we going to do next?
That sounds really interesting. Let's go back to the beginning with military fiction. In our discussions, we've mentioned before that military fiction may have come out of espionage literature. Is that where military fiction comes from? Or did it become its own thing in its own entity all by itself?
No, it started with the military espionage The thrillers set in World War I, World War II, and that time era, and then it just grew with more and more authors got into it, and they started doing more and more things, like in the Vietnam War, the Cold War, and it just grew, and now it is its own genre as recognized by Library of Congress.
Is it a genre that erupted like after World War II, like in the late 1940s and like started building, or is it one that was like more established in like the 60s and 70s and 80s?
I would say the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s with the Cold War, the Vietnam era, and then the end of the Cold War, the coming down of the Berlin Wall, some of the wars that we fought since then, the war in Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and up to the present day. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some books about how the US withdrew from Afghanistan in a year or so.
Yeah, it seems like they take it right out of the headlines and use that as their inspiration. So we've heard that real life, real wars inspired military fiction. Do you think some of the authors have military backgrounds, or are they doing the research to get that kind of detail that you mentioned about, like Tom Clancy?
Some of them do have military background. Dale Brown, one of the authors that I've read, he was a bombardier on a B-52 bomber for the United States Air Force, and one of his books, Fight of the Old Dog, was the name of his aircraft. The B-52 was called the Old Dog. And I saw a picture one time of the nose of the aircraft, and there's this old dog with a chain around its neck saying, "Beware of the old dog" on it.
Well, if you have a B-52 bomber that's flying around, you probably want to beware of the B-52 bomber. Just a thought. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's not something I'm familiar with, but that's all right. We're learning a lot tonight. What would be a great title to introduce somebody who's never read military fiction, who may not be into a book that is 1,000 pages long, as a step into, as an introductory title of military fiction?
The first book that I mentioned, Hunt for Red October by Tom Clancy, is only about 350 pages long. That was his first book he wrote. He didn't like it, so he shelved it for a couple years, and friends and family read it and said, "Tom, you got to publish this thing." Well, he published it, and look what his name and all of his books went from there.
Yeah, that Jack Ryan.
Yeah, and he's a local guy. He was supposedly set down in Annapolis.
Yeah, there's a lot of love for Tom Clancy in Maryland. So we talked about your favorite book and what's a great introductory title, but what about favorite authors in general?
Okay, my favorite author is Tom Clancy, W.E.B. Griffin. I like to read a Dale Brown every now and then, Harold Coyle, All-Star McLean, Stephen Kuntz. I mix them up. When I see new books come in to the library over on our new bookshelf, I like to go over and check them out, read them, bring them back. And some of these authors now are letting other people use their names, which to me isn't kosher, but hey, it's all for making a buck, because a book with Jack Ryan or Tom Clancy's name on will sell better than a book with Joe Schmo's name on it.
That may be true, but at the same time, I think fans of, for instance, Jack Ryan are looking for more content for him. So unfortunately, since Tom Clancy passed away, it's impossible for him to write more content. But, fans are probably clamoring like, "I want more, I want more." So the estate was like, "All right, we'll give you more with an author who we feel is worthy of the Tom Clancy name." So it's interesting how that happens, because James Patterson is not deceased, but he does write multiple authors, and V.C. Andrews is very similar to Tom Clancy as well. Fans asked for it and they're getting it. So, there's a lot of love there. So is there a lot of diversity in the military fiction genre?
when it started, there wasn't. It was mainly the older white male. But now women are becoming writers of it. There is the author Kristen Feehan, who, while she does have some military missions in her books, her main thing is the romance. There was a woman who lived up at West Point for a time when her father was the superintendent, and she wrote a book about 3 female cadets with their time and their tribulations at West Point, and then she followed them out into their lives after West Point. More and more women, people of color, other nationalities, other races are becoming authors. It is not just the old white man's club anymore like it used to be.
Yeah, because for a while there, like in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of the middle-aged white man would be the predominant military fiction author, like Tom Clancy, Dale Brown, Clive Cussler. Like, that's when I think of military fiction, that's what I see in military fiction. And speaking as somebody who likes contemporary romance with a little splash of action thriller, Christine Feehan is actually one of my favorite authors. And yes, there is military fiction involved as a subplot, though, as a definite subplot. Is there a more recent book that you've read recently, like recently published title?
There's a book called, I'm into it right now, called The President's Daughter. It's a James Patterson book, and I just picked it up from my father over the weekend, and I just cracked the cover last night, so to speak. I'm on like page 1. Just started.
Is it James Patterson with somebody, or is it James?
I believe it's with former President Bill Clinton.
I was wondering because Bill Clinton has written a couple titles with James Patterson, and most of them are set in like presidential military style. So they have a distinct setting and distinct information. And being that President Clinton was in fact a president, then there's definitely some information he knows that nobody else would have access to.
Yeah, I mean, he used to carry around a little orange card in his wallet that if things got real bad, there were codes on it, and he had to give that code to the guys at the missile headquarters.
Yeah, that's very true. So one thing with military fiction, as we talked about earlier, there's been a lot of detail is needed to carry a story. Like for the ones that are heavily detailed, and even the ones that are using it as a subplot, they have to have the detail to make it feel like it could really happen. Like that's what military fiction does. It makes you feel like it's something that either could have happened, will happen, or is happening. Have you ever encountered an inconsistency in a story and you've been like, what? That is not a possibility. What in the world were you thinking putting this in that story?
Yes, in one of the Tom Clancy books, they bring a United States Navy cruiser up the Potomac River, into the Anacostia River, and to the Washington Navy Yard to protect DC from a Chinese missile attack. There's just one problem. You can't get a cruiser under the 9th Street Bridge. It's not a drawbridge. And
you sure they didn't just remove the bridge from the river? No. Okay.
No. And I mean, even with when they built the new Woodrow Wilson Bridge, they still can't get a military ship up there, even though it is a drawbridge. The draw span's not wide enough. And I mean, little problem. You have a ship that's 200 feet tall and you only have a bridge that's 100. They don't make them as a convertible.
Nope. Unless they're drawbridges, they're fairly static in place. You can't really move them easily.
Yeah, and I've also a couple things in some other Tom Clancy books. A friend of mine who was a military sergeant, Army Air Force supply sergeant, when Tom Clancy was signing books down at the Officers Club at Andrews one time, he took my copy of Clear and Present Danger down and got author Clancy to sign it. And he said, by the way, Mr. Clancy, I know DC. You can't get a cruiser through the 9th Street Bridge. And Tom says, yeah, I found that out after I wrote the book.
So
And
clearly fans can call out an author. There are forums for it, and in fact, talking to the author. It's definitely entertaining. It's fun because those details make the story, but they also can sometimes detract from the story because it gets too nitty-gritty. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that can be true. I mean, yes, it's good to know approximately the dimensions of a ship that you're sailing on, but you don't need to know that there are 27 sailors' bunks in this forward berthing room, or that there are 22 place settings in the captain's dining room.
But did something happen in the captain's dining room where that information became really important?
In one of the books I read, they were having it was a British destroyer, and they were in the middle of a storm, hurricane type, out over off the coast of Korea, and the captain unfortunately got seasick.
Oh, that's my life.
And
So.
and he's told the American officer that was with him, wait 20 minutes and come into my dining room. And the American officer remarked, Captain, why is there so much space here? He says, well, in normal times when the ship isn't rolling around like a cork, I can have up to 22 people in this room for dinner or a conference. And I don't think you need to know that British World War II type destroyer can hold 22 people in the captain's dining room.
Well, there might be some fans who are really fascinated by that glimpse into British military boat history or
Yes.
ship history, as the case may be.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit more about some of the titles and genres that exist.
Okay.
Is there a series that is your favorite military fiction series?
That would probably be the Webb Griffin series that has it starts out in World War II, and the latest book I've read about it was in the Korean War. It's the book about the CIA and the Marines that are in the OSS at the time.
Is it the Brotherhood series?
Yeah, the Brotherhood of War series. Thank you, Karen.
So
It was his Brotherhood of War series. The reason I like it so much, it starts out before World War II with the main character who is a corporal in a Marine regiment in China. We had Marines in China to protect our interests there before the Pearl Harbor. And then this gentleman had the flair for languages. He could read and write Chinese fluently, read and write Japanese fluently. So they brought him home to make him an officer. Well, Ken, his name was Ken, and this followed him after he went through OCS, which is how the military takes
officer candidate school.
Yes, through his officer candidate school down at Quantico in Virginia, and followed then Lieutenant McCoy through his time in the Pacific on Guadalcanal and some other hush-hush missions that he did. And he got promoted to captain. And then he went over into China to help establish a weather station so that the American Army Air Corps could get weather conditions for when the B-29s were raiding Japan. They needed to know what the weather would be in Japan. And then he came home as a major. And then the book pauses for the time from 1945 to the Korean War. And then Ken is called back into at that time, the CIA, OSS, and he goes over to Korea and captures a few North Koreans and gets some rather good intelligence out of them. He also helps rescue his best friend in the world, Major Malcolm Pickering, called Pick, who was a Marine Corps fighter pilot, got shot down. And after spending 70 some days behind enemy lines, Ken finds Pick, and the story goes on from there. And unfortunately, I'm waiting for the book where it keeps going and Ken becomes more than just a major, because I think the next thing in the group, he'll become a lieutenant colonel and on and on.
So the Brotherhood of War series starts in 1945 and goes up to what, the Korean War era, which is about what, 10, 12 years, give or take?
Yeah, it's Korean War was 50 through 53. This book, the first one, I think was about 1939, late 1939.
So it started at the very early, before the US got involved in World War II.
Yes.
Yeah.
So late fall 1939 is the first thing I saw in the book, because Webb Griffin always would say like 2 September 1945.
Yeah, give you some time frames.
Yes.
What is OSS?
That was the Office of Strategic Services, which was started by President Franklin Roosevelt for intelligence gathering.
The precursor to the CIA?
Yeah, one of the precursors to the CIA. The OSS was basically started in early World War II and went up after we won the war with Germany and the war with Japan. President Harry Truman was given some bad advice by some of his military advisors. Get rid of the OSS, let the Army Intelligence, the CID, Criminal Intelligence Division, or the Naval Intelligence people run everything. Well, it just didn't work out. And Harry Truman, after about 6 to 8 months of running without a central intelligence agency, in early 1946, in fact, January of 46, signed the executive orders creating the Central Intelligence Agency, and which it's grown and now has all those buildings over in Langley, Virginia.
Yeah, I'd imagine that getting information from either Army intelligence, naval intelligence would not necessarily be enough information or perspective on the overall needs necessary. Like it's one perspective versus like the broad picture of everything.
Yeah, and when you're making decisions that affect the world, you need to know the entire picture, not just one little corner of it.
Yeah. So we were talking about the Brotherhood of War series. So that's your most favorite ever. Do you have a newer series that you would recommend?
With the newer series, any of the Dale Brown, like Flight of the Old Dog. I know that's been a few years since he made that one. I like, I'm reading another Webb Griffin right now called The Enemies of My Enemies. And that it's set right after World War II in Europe. And the main character is a young US captain who has distinguished himself during World War II, and President Truman gave him the head of DCI, Director of Central Intelligence, Europe, as a consolation prize. He went from a second lieutenant to a captain, and he's 26 years old. And it's rather interesting reading what two 26-year-old captains are doing against the old stogies, the old generals and colonels and everything, and getting away with it because they have a friend sitting at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yeah, things happen apparently. So we mentioned previously that there's not a lot of diversity in the authors, right? I wanted to highlight a couple of my favorites because as we've been talking, I've been thinking like, maybe I am actually pretty familiar with military fiction, but it's the contemporary military romance genre that I'm all about. Because that's
that's a great one, Karen.
It's a new subgenre that exists in the military fiction land, and there are a ton of authors who I just looked up and I was like, oh wait, I have read every single one of these authors, and they all happen to be women authors, like Maya Banks, She writes some awesome, very detailed titles. Suzanne Brockman, she's written a ton of stuff, and Julie Ann Walker, which she doesn't have as many titles out there, but what she does write is definitely worth sitting down and reading for a few minutes. And being that I read, once I start, I can't put a book down. I can tell you I gobble them up incessantly the second a new title comes out. So there's definitely increasing diversity, because these are all contemporary titles, contemporary authors that are creeping up, and they've only been increasing over the past few years. So just throwing that out there. The Ghost Walker series by Christine Feehan is one of my favorites. That's the military genre she writes. So
I'll have to look into that.
Just saying, like, there's something for us out there that's not just Tom Clancy and Dale Brown. And
yeah, I'm glad to see that there are women getting into the genre now, because I mean, for a while there, as we've said before, it was just the middle-aged white man group.
And the characters were usually focused on the male character as the strong white male character being the lead person. And all the ones I've read have had the strong female character as the lead, which is, excellent for us.
Yes. We all need diversity. I mean, we have to include everyone.
Yeah. So that brings me to my next question, because I'm talking about military romance as a subgenre of military fiction. What other subgenres exist that you're aware of?
Well, there's the military science fiction, which I don't get into. I'm not that much of a science fiction guy. I did read a little bit of Star Trek when I was younger, and I had a teacher in high school that she loved Star Trek. And that's the way I got an A in the class, was read a Star Trek novel and make a report on it.
There you go.
Yeah, there's that. There's a military there's still military espionage, and we hear more and more every day of how people are selling out their country for money. And then that guy with the WikiLeaks, I mean, he's still in the news every once in a while. I don't know if he's still sitting over in that embassy in Britain, with asylum. But I mean, they say patriotism is the last thing that goes with the scoundrels. I mean, most of it's money. I mean, you give somebody $100,000 and they need the money, they'll do stuff for you.
Yeah, I don't know. But another subgenre that we didn't touch on was paranormal. Now, is that one you're familiar with?
Not really. I don't get in much into the paranormal.
So paranormal military fiction features characters who have enhanced abilities, whether they are enhanced hearing, speed, or agility. So they have enhanced abilities to do things. So like I said, there's a lot of new subgenres coming out in this military fiction land. It's definitely changing courses from what at least I particularly believed was a genre that was wasn't my cup of tea. Military fiction, I should say. It's nice to know that I was wrong and that I've actually been indulging myself in it for quite a few years. So do you have recommendations for titles that are set during World War I?
Yes, one of them, The Guns of August, was a book it actually set right before World War I in August of 1914.
And who's
before the world went to war. And that was by Barbara Tuchman.
Barbara Tuchman?
Yes. We even have a copy of it here in the Laurel Library.
Yay. What about World War II?
World War II would probably be any of the Webb Griffin in his World War II series. I would say, combat. There's a couple combat ones that are there with any of his books about the Japanese, when the OSS is over in combat. I'm going blank on the author right now.
It's all right, but Webb Griffin, for the most part, is a fairly prolific World War II era author.
Yes.
The Cold War, would that be
The Cold-
Tom Clancy would be ideal?
Yes, any of your Tom Clancy's, because most of the Tom Clancy's, it's the U.S. versus the Russians.
Mhm.
Also, some of the newer Webb Griffin books, like Death at Nuremberg,
Mm.
which is set right after World War II, starting of the Cold War, because really the Cold War didn't start until 1946, 47, when the Soviets started clamping down around Berlin. And then, of
Mm.
course, we all remember the Berlin blockade, where they said, all right, no one gets in or out.
Yeah.
And then President Truman did the famous Berlin airlift, where they took everything from gasoline to coal to beans and shoes in and brought people out on the C-47s and C-54s of the U.S. Air Force at that time.
Hmm.
And they even, one of the pilots even got Hershey bars and made little parachutes and dropped them to the children of Berlin. As he was flying into Tempelhof Airport, he would open up his window and kick out a bunch of Hershey bars. And it grew so much, he thought he was going to get, he was called to headquarters. He thought he was going to get shot down from this. Well, the general said, go for it. They got Hershey's Chocolate Company to provide they provided 2 rail cars full of chocolate bars,
Oh,
and kids in schools would make little parachutes out of handkerchiefs, and they would send them over to Germany to the bases, and they would load them up. And as they came over the apartments of Berlin, they would just throw them out the door to the children.
oh my goodness, that's awesome. I did not know that story.
Yeah.
What about post-Cold War titles?
Post-Cold War. Well, that could be some of your later Tom Clancy's, like Point of Contact, which it has Tom Clancy's name on it, but I don't believe Clancy wrote it, since it's only been out for like 3 years, and Tom Clancy died in like 2013, 2014. It's where Jack Ryan is now president of the US, and his son, Jack Jr., works for a government agency, sort of super CIA, that when President Ryan has a problem, he calls the firm, as it's called, and they go over and take care of business.
Not John Grisham's firm, right? It's
No,
Tom Clancy's firm.
Tom Clancy.
Right.
Yeah,
Just
and
making sure we had the right firm involved here.
yes, because there was the book by John Grisham about the firm, which was a mafia front law firm down in Memphis, Tennessee.
Exactly. And more recently, even though it is still technically post-Cold War era, but the wars on terror, because there's more than just one war on terror. There's the wars on terror. So those are going to be like the 1990s and beyond.
Yes, and you'll start seeing some of them now that I think we're out of Afghanistan. I think that's going to be a big area that they're going to go into.
Do you find that as military documents are declassified, that more books might come out featuring those wars as that information becomes more available for research purposes?
Yes, I do. I think the authors and their research staffs will go and get these documents and, turn them into books, and stuff that we only heard snippets about. Give it 5, 10, 15 years, there'll be books of pretty good size out about it, because it's now declassified. Anyone can see it.
And while not a true event, because it is still a fiction story, it is based in reality, but fictionalized to make it a bestseller.
Right.
And then the last question I have would be, what events or eras do you think aren't very represented in military fiction or any of its subgenres right now?
Right now, the time frame between the end of the Korean era, which is 1953, when the quote armistice was signed between the North Koreans, the US, and the South Koreans. And the middle to, I'd say about 1970, 1975, more on the Cold War era and the startup of the Vietnam era. Because, I mean, we've had troops in Vietnam since, President Eisenhower put the first few advisors in there. And then we kept increasing as the administrations go on through the Kennedy administration, and President Johnson got real prolific. And then the drawdown and the pullout during the Nixon administration, you don't hear too much about that. The era in the middle of the Vietnam era, we don't see that much about it now. And also, as you get closer to modern times, you don't see that much military fiction. But I do think as documents are declassified and time goes on, we will start seeing more and more books about those eras.
That'll be interesting to see what transpires, because yeah, the war in Vietnam wasn't necessarily declared immediately after the Korean War. It was just kind of like subtly sending people overseas, and then
advisors.
And then the declaration of whatever war on that unique day, instead of just like making it an official start of it. So it was like very subtle, and then it was like, now we're at war type.
Yeah, after the Tonkin Gulf incident, where the North Koreans sent a Tonkin Gulf or something, sent a couple speedboats after a couple destroyers and fired some torpedoes at the destroyers, fortunately missing the US destroyers. But that got President Johnson's nerve up, and he said, all right, we're going over there. We're going to kick their rear ends.
But that's quite a few years from the Eisenhower administration to the Johnson administration. There's there's almost a decade in there of time before it was officially declared a war. Anyway, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Jimmy, do you have any last words on military fiction as a genre, or recommended titles?
Okay, with a couple recommended titles I have, which I just have recently read, is The Deserter by Nelson DeMille. It's about a gentleman over in Afghanistan, US Army captain, who one day walks away from his unit.
Well,
and a pair of Army CID, Criminal Investigation Division agents, a man and a lady, finally track him down in Venezuela. And they go down and convince him to come back and stand trial and clear his name. Then there's also The Assassination Option by Webb Griffin, which I am reading. That takes place over in Germany, right after World War II, 1946. And in that book, a young US Army captain who's in charge of the CID in Germany, and he's also a pilot, flies into East Germany, picks up the wife and two children of a Russian NKVD, which is their precursor to the KGB, who defected and is now living in Argentina, picks up his wife and kids and gets them out. I won't say any more on the book, so not to spoil it. And I think that this is going to be, in the next 10, 15 years, or even earlier, as things become declassified, a very good genre to read. It will help you understand history of our country and of the world. And I look forward to seeing what comes out in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you, Jimmy.
You're welcome, Karen.
Thank you, Jimmy, for sharing all of your love of military fiction with us. And it's been a real pleasure learning that I have actually myself been enjoying military fiction this entire time.